Koyukon Athabascan, my name means the bringer of the sun. Plants and animals and even our non-human relatives like stones may have spirits. Physical energy into its spirit energy, and that's why we use things like sage, because hemlock is notoriously poisonous. I would say there's 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States and a couple hundred who are also state or self-recognized. Our healing practices are being rejuvenated. Tribal clinics that have taken over our health system since the 1980s, promoting awareness of traditional healing, and then really looking at what assets are and how it could be incorporated, say, for example, into learning settings.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to You Create's podcast, Many Different Birds, broadcasting on CJSW Radio, where we will hear authentic stories from special guests from all backgrounds and bridge the gap between non-Indigenous and Indigenous communities, with a special focus on the Canadian healthcare system.
We want to open up the floor to honest discussions and get a deeper insight into how we can improve our healthcare practices and work on our own biases.
You're listening to CJSW 90.9 FM, broadcasting from Calgary, Alberta, at the University of Calgary campus radio station, which sits on Treaty 7 land. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. This includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, made up of the Siksika, Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, District 5 and 6. Additionally, the University of Calgary is located where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, a place the Blackfoot people called Mohensis, which is now known as the City of Calgary. And today, we are truly honored to be speaking with such an incredible individual today, Dr. Allison Kelliher, who is joining us as our very first international guest. Dr. Kelliher is an Alaskan Native physician and traditional healer from the Koyukon Athabascan Dene culture. She's board certified in family and integrative medicine and is the director of the Indigenous Healing Program at Tanana Chiefs Conference in Fairbanks, Alaska.
With a background in neuroscience, Dr. Kelliher is also a biomedical researcher, health policy advocate, and educator, working to bring traditional healing practices into modern healthcare. She's affiliated with several universities, including the University of Alaska and the University of Washington, and she advocates for planetary health on a global scale. So, we're excited to dive into her unique journey and discuss how traditional and modern medicine can complement each other. So, Dr. Kelliher, have we missed anything? Would you like to add anything before we jump in?
Well, I just want to thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to join you here, and I'm especially passionate about natural medicine such as plants. I think botanicals and our connection to our surroundings and land-based healing are some things I'm very passionate about. I also want to give a shout out for our traditional languages and understanding that language helps us to form our thoughts and contributes to our ideas and concepts of self. So really so many different exciting developments within the science of traditional Indigenous knowledges to share today. So thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much for coming, and we're so excited. Like Nidhi introduced, you're our first international guest, so I think we're going to have a really good recording session today. Before we start, though, I know you said that you're really passionate about plants, specifically botanical. Um, where did that passion come from?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. So I came into healing naturally. Our tribe has had the belief that medicine follows in our families and that we inherit medicine. Sometimes we say it skips a generation, but I knew that medicine people were in my ancestry on my grandmother's side, Minoy Lekan Se Uza. So I descend from the bringer of the sun in my language, Danaka. And in our Koyukon Athabascan language, as it's called by anthropologists in Danaka, we have a duality. So the duality of our language means that in Koyukon Athabascan, my name means the bringer of the sun. And um, because we have a duality in Koyukon Athabascan languages, it also means the bringer of the moon. And I just grew up knowing that I had healing gifts, and I started with hands on healing around the age of 4. So before kindergarten, when I had enough weight, I
Mm.
would walk on my family's back. And then around plant medicine, I knew that it was a way to heal, and the growing season is real short in the north. So I knew willow and our kind of sage and yarrow were some of our main plant medicines up north. And
Mm.
we say sometimes the plants are so strong up there, you only need one plant and to know it really good. So, for example, willow comes up in the spring and its shoots are edible, and
Mm.
it's really high in vitamin C, and it
Mm.
can be used for fever, but also it has other phytonutrients and lots of other properties. You see, because plants can't go to the pharmacy, they have to have all their medicine inside them.
Mm.
So plants have lots of different aspects. And of course, I could go on and on about my passion for plant medicine for our plant relatives. But really, what gets me excited is that plant knowledge belongs to the people and it's been passed down for generations. And when we know about plant medicine, it's said that we care better for the plants and for the earth. And so recognizing the important relationship that we as people and stewards of the land, all lands, have to recognize our relatives, those plants, and the roles that they play in our lives. Um,
Mm.
so many different ways. We can eat them, we can medicine them, but actually they help to detoxify the earth as well. They're even looking
Yeah.
into plants putting gold in their bodies, or how we could use plants to extract things, maybe toxic things or other things like metals from
Mm.
earth. So they're real knowledge bearers for what it's worth.
Yeah. And I really like the herbal medicine for that reason because it's so natural. I feel like sometimes medicine, it is man-made in a way, and I feel like sometimes we kind of have to find that balance between using certain medications that are man-made that we know help, but also integrating like that herbal medicine practice in it because again, like you said, a lot of plants are filled with vitamin C. For example, they can strip toxins, for example, metals out of our body, and it's something that we don't, when we look at a medicine, I think of a pill. But I feel like we need to, when I think of a medicine, I should also think of a plant. Um, so before Nidhi asks the next question, I did have one question for you before that. Is there a specific plant that you resonate with, or is one of your favorites, or is something that, you know, is just, it's your plant? It's something that you would define yourself with, maybe.
Yeah, I really love the question, and the theme here I think is willow. Willow bark. There's different types of willow, maybe
Mm-hmm.
20 different types of willow, and they can hybridize. So, like blueberries or huckleberries. So sometimes the Western distinction between species gets blurred, and I love it when they're nonlinear things. So if I could say that willow bark and willow plant, we say has a protective spirit. And I was taught that because you can bend it, it can be bent into um, a circle of protection, a circle of prayer, a circle to wear on your wrist, a circle for healing, a circle to that you can place on the wall, or a place of respect, or at the entry to a home,
Mm.
because the willow has a protective kind spirit. You see, we believe that plants and animals and even our non-human relatives like stones may have spirits. So when we burn the plant transforms from its physical energy into its spirit energy, and that's why we use things like sage, for example, to purify or smudge with and bring our
Mm-hmm.
prayers to Creator in a different realm, in that higher place of the sky people. Um, so willow has so many wonderful aspects, especially in that it's anti-inflammatory. It can be used for aches and pains. It can be used internally in the form of a tea, but it
Mm.
could also be taken as something like capsules or as a tincture. It could be used as a wash or a soak for injuries, but also can be used for arthritis or aches and pains. And by the way, willow's main constituents include things like aspirin like substances, aspirin like chemicals called um, salicylic acid. And
Yeah.
then if you put in some chemicals on it, if you put some other stuff, acetylsalicylic acid, I believe then it
Yeah.
becomes aspirin, right? So, so willow has real medicine and it's measurable and patented in Western medicine. But
Mm.
actually, willow has constituents that protect your gut from the um, the gut irritation that can happen with things like aspirin. So plants have complex medicines.
Mm.
They have all these constituents, and sometimes they have the ability uh, to temper the effects of other constituents within the plant itself. So so many lessons, and thanks for asking about
Yeah.
my favorite plant.
Yeah, no worries. You did teach me a lot of lessons, and I like the idea that you said about when you're burning it, it's like you're releasing the spirit, and it made me think of when you do burn or smudge sage, that's essentially you just don't think of it like that. So it's kind of changing your perspective. So thank you for sharing that. That really resonated with me.
I agree. I think willow is an incredible, incredible plant based on everything you've said. It seems to be very multifaceted, and to kind of go down that angle of when you burn willow and it releases a certain sort of energy, and you said that plants also have a spirit. Um, I'm just trying to learn here, but is that how plants originally, do you think, communicated with, for instance, your ancestors to say, hey, this is like, these are the properties, this is what we need to use? This herb, this medicine, or this plant is medicinal, and how did your ancestors differentiate between poisonous plants versus medicinal plants?
Well, thanks so much for asking. It helps that in Alaska we have less than 20 toxic plants, but there are some that can toxify others, which might be in your neck of the woods as well. One we should be aware of is called hemlock, and that is it resembles a celery-like plant, if you will, but like the parsley kind of shapes of they call it the double umbel, but anyways, it's an umbrella-like shape and it grows in swampy areas. Caution, it can toxify other nearby plants. So actually identifying that plant can be important because hemlock is notoriously poisonous. Outside of that, I would say, and there can be a couple of grass looking plants, okay, that are, or at least one that's quite toxic. But we can be reassured to use traditional ways of being guided. That can include things like shared intergenerational knowledge. So, my people and ancestors and teachers, such as Bernadette Alvana Stimful and others, sharing with me in my hometown of Nome, Alaska, that yarrow is an important plant medicine, and learning from her teachings has been very helpful. The other medicine I learned about we call it stinkweed. It's Artemisia, and it's Artemisia tilesii, Tilesii. Artemisia is related to the absinthe plant, and wormwood family, which is very, very powerful for anti-helminthics, anti-worm, but also antibacterial, etc. And we use this as a fumigant. We were talking about burning plants, so we would maybe make this into a tea, but we can also use it as a switch in a maki, or like a sweat bath, a steam bath. But also you can use plant medicine to burn it. You can also use this in other ways, but the shape of the plant medicine is what communicates to us. So the shape of Artemisia actually looks like caribou antlers. Or it also looks like raven's foot. And raven's foot is known as a thing of respect, because raven reflects our creation stories. Raven can also be our trickster in our stories. But Creator Raven is said to have made humans, and also created us in a way that made us vulnerable. So we had to make agreements with other animals, other relatives, in order to survive in the environment that we were at in the subarctic and Arctic regions. And there, upon which we have a long-standing respect and ways to be in relationship with our surroundings, in balance with our environment, to maintain those relationships with the animals, and to be able to wear of their clothing with our moose hide, our wolverine hide, our and all of the other pieces that go into that story. So plants we can learn about from animals and their behavior. I've seen bears, for example, digging up devil's club root, which is a form of ginseng in the north. So we look to other teachers, squirrels, and also, of course, our dreams. And I'm taught that if I'm going to take the root and the life of a plant, that I have to meditate and spend the night out there in the field to pray for and ask for medicine from that sentient being, that knowledgeable plant medicine that is in relationship with us. So not all plants speak English, and I don't always speak all the plant languages. So sometimes there are different ways that we can get our knowledges.
Wow, that's a really beautiful answer. And throughout your entire answer, I'm hearing a lot of interconnectedness between us, between plants, between other animals, and how we can learn from each other, and also between ourselves, or yourself and your ancestors and your teachers, and how they pass down that knowledge. So is a lot of that knowledge, when that's passed down, is it a lot of it through oral tradition, or are there written records anywhere?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that the goal is to create more of a written compendium. My goal is to create a traditional healing text and resource. That's sort of a dynamic online resource that could also be co-owned by tribes and tribal entities. Because some of our knowledges are sacred and protected and owned by our cultures, and some of our knowledges can be shared, and those things have been written down sometimes. So, for example, some of our creation stories from my area are documented by Richard Nelson, and Make Prayers to the Raven was a book that he wrote about my mom's Athabascan culture. And then there's been anthropological documentation about other great healers from the north. Della Keats was one, and my other teacher, Rita Blumenstein, who is celebrated in Alaska as we have a day named after her, and she's since transitioned to the spirit world a few years ago. So I speak of her fondly, but I can say that she said her grandmother spoke of a time when the white raven would signify a time for our medicine to return. And there have been white ravens spotted from Vancouver Island to Anchorage, Alaska. There's a very well-known white raven followed on social medias. So the point being that it seems like an auspicious time for prophecies in Native prophecies. There's also people coming forward from Hopi and other Southwest tribes prophecies. I hear Navajo as well has prophecies. So thinking about how people say there's a time to return to our traditional knowledges, and it does make sense with, I think, the challenges that we have with an extractive economy based on resources that are limited, that alternatives that create opportunities for us to live with less footprints and in more sustainable ways must be considered. This is especially important in light of the work we do with the United Nations and World Health Organization around Indigenous determinants of health, and exploring that 6% of us on the planet identify as Indigenous, caring for 80+% of the world's biodiversity, and thus planetary health hinges upon helping to support Indigenous lifeways so that we can protect these intact ecosystems, and especially concepts and ideas that are still held by our non-human relatives in these old growth forests.
Wow, that's an incredible statistic. 6% of the world's population is Indigenous, and they care for, you said 85%?
Yeah, yep. It could be 86 to 90+% depending on the studies. So yeah, it's 80+%. Isn't that
Wow,
something?
that is an incredible statistic.
Yeah, it's 65% of the world's old growth forests. So
Yeah, and do you see a lot of parallels when you work? I'm assuming here, but do you work with other Indigenous peoples across the world, it seems?
yeah, there luckily are coalitions of Indigenous folks who are doing research on themselves, such as Saminor in the Sami population in Northern Europe. And so there are also excellent researchers of course, in Canada. I would say Nicole Redvers and her teams and collaborators are doing such tremendous work, but also others, especially in Australia and New Zealand. A shout out to folks in Alaska at UAF and UAA. I just believe there's so much good work going on in the space as far as scholarship. And sorry, I think I kind of spaced out on the exact question.
No, that's okay. I was just curious to see if there's any parallels between different Indigenous communities across the world. Is there a similar way you practice and look at plants, or is
Yes.
there a lot of differences?
Yeah, so I would say that, there are thousands of different perspectives from Indigenous um, tribal foundations. And I would say there's 578 federally recognized tribes. Wait, I would say there's 570. No, no. Yes. Okay. I would say there's 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States and a couple hundred who are also state or self-recognized. And in Turtle Island, which is North America, including Canada and Mexico and the US, that we have thousands, above a couple thousand different tribes. So for me to speak for all of those tribes in a pan-Indigenous voice is impossible, but I do my best. And I will say that all of us that I'm aware of are earth-based, meaning that we recognize our life, and sustaining life comes directly from the earth, not necessarily in packages or pill bottles. Nothing condescending about modern medicine. I am a doctor fully trained in family medicine and board certified in integrative and holistic medicine in inpatient and outpatient. And throughout the experience of life, I've been a practicing doc for over 20 years. But also, um, there are certain things that Native people have in common. By far and largely, we have all experienced settler colonial experiences that result in a myriad of illnesses that typically follow a similar pattern of disparities of those who experience marginalization. So we suffer things like diabetes, heart disease, obesity, um, high cholesterol, hypertension, these kinds of chronic diseases. And interestingly, traditional medicines or holistic methods of medicine, such as traditional Chinese medicine, or maybe even homeopathy, naturopathy, osteopathy, whole systems of medicine offer whole system medicine that have their underpinnings in traditional indigenous practices have other alternatives, less expensive ways for us to address chronic disease.
Mm-hmm.
So there's lots of reasons for us to look at these other indigenous and traditional modalities. A lot of folks who are vulnerable are cared for by traditional healers. So that's 80% of vulnerable populations in places like China and Africa. I know that in reservation settings and in communities in Alaska Native and American Indian communities, our healing practices are being rejuvenated. And so I would say that traditional healers and access to traditional medicines are important for our communities. And then also being self-defined and self-determined are things that we also have in common. So yeah, even though it's hard for me to speak for us all, I do my best, and these are some of the things that I've arrived at. But we also have a lot of this type of thing written down, and have an active dialogue around this at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, where we've been authoring concepts around these ideas of what are Indigenous determinants of health and how some of these nuances of us experiencing colonization, some of us hundreds of years ago, some of us more recently, um, how those experiences continue to influence us, and then how we can have strengths-based approaches and also find solutions and approaches that help us to level the playing field so that treatments aren't as exclusive and are more available, especially if they're practical, such as incorporating dandelion into your diet.
Right. Wow, that's a lot of information, and there's a lot of tangents I'd like to go on, but I think you are a wealth of knowledge. But first
Yes.
off, let's talk. I think we should talk about how you feel about when you have these conversations with different delegates from across the world, and when you are at these UN forums. Do you think that after having these conversations, we're seeing action being implemented, and that, I guess, after that first initial conversation, are we seeing more dialogue happening? Are we seeing change being brought?
And I would also say if you could also comment on how do these UN forums take place? Like what happens there? Because I feel like we hear about them, but I never really know what is actually happening as like a outsider, you know? I feel like that would be a really good insight for our listeners.
Great. So, one of my favorite ways to get involved in the UN is to be aware that there's actually a UN TV, and that
Mm.
has, especially when it's featuring the permanent forum. on Indigenous issues, that is a great way to familiarize yourself with kind of what's going on, boots on the ground at the actual forum. Um,
Hmm.
there is a website, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and I believe that the dates for the meeting in New York, where we'll actually be having dialogue and be listening to each other on the floor at the forum, will be April 21st through May 1st or something like this.
It's coming
Um,
up.
yes, and so the process of being involved in it personally can be cumbersome, and is kind of about knowing who has spaces for attendees to help you get registered, because you have to
Hmm.
register and then have an official ID um, to get into the forum. So folks should reach out to the Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance if you're interested in joining the coalition. And we have been organizing to this effect of having Indigenous representation that may even be separate from and distinct from member states, because not all member states recognize indigeneity and concepts of indigeneity, even though the indigeneity isn't a perfect word to describe the original peoples to a specific place. We still use this term. And I think that what I've seen in my last handful of years being involved is that we can bring scholars together to have challenging dialogue and try to see which levers can be pushed in order to better have representation. So, publishing
Hmm.
papers to this effect makes a difference. We're working on matrices and different measurements, different types of metrics that will help us to also follow whether or not Indigenous wellness in countries and organizations is being achieved. So we're looking at scorecards and developing scorecards over time. And I think your question is well taken, though. To what end? To what end is all of this? Are we making enough progress? Is what I sometimes ask, and I have to. I have to have faith, my sister would say.
Yeah.
I have to trust that the our ancestors' prayers are fueling us, and my prayers and thoughts and intentions will fuel not only myself, but hopefully future generations through methods like what you're doing right now. And that this work is beyond any single one of us. And certainly it's a multi generational problem, what we have going on, eating all of these resources at the expense of the folks who literally are disenfranchised or otherwise
Hmm.
disadvantaged. And it's just unethical, a lot of the dynamics that we're seeing, particularly with the U.S. pulling out of the UN priorities, and the general milieu in policy is challenging, I'd say, for Native people, with the birthright citizenship and other things being questioned. Because in America, we celebrate that we at least have a unique and distinct political status as American Indian and Alaska Native peoples. And I'm concerned that certain policy and politics could threaten that. Thus, it's been held up in the Supreme Court. And I'm grateful for that. But I do think there's an aspect of being Indigenous on the planetary level that calls us beyond our national identities and really brings us to the table beyond that. So
Yeah.
there are ways to get involved where the rubber really hits the road, and how do we make a difference on a large scale yesterday? We're still working on it, right? I think what you see on the international forum is sometimes those big pockets, deep pockets, and money are still getting involved, rather um, are still getting involved. But I say we better control the dialogue and try to, as best we can, influence those systems so that they're changing. I think we have
Hmm.
to change some systems from inside. I don't know that how we always do that. If you can't change influential systems, then you have to get rid of them, it seems. So, and I don't know who holds all of the power for for all these types of things we're talking about, like whether it's resource extraction, or whether it's also the practice of medicine, or um, how we define health systems, right? And
Yeah,
and who has access to healing knowledge and information. That's a big
yeah.
systematic question.
It makes me think that whenever we do advocate for policy change, no matter how passionate we can be, it's such a slow and gruesome process sometimes.
Yes,
Um, that it takes more than just one conversation. It can take up to 100 conversations.
right.
But let's say when you are at the UN forum, let's say we do come up with a policy change. Does it work that every country will then now try to implement that in their systems and try to work on it? Is that kind of how it works out?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I feel like we can make certain recommendations moving forward,
Mm-hmm.
and whether or not there's compliance with implementation um, remains to be seen. And I think that incentivizing those kinds of changes is is tricky, and I think we're trying
Mm-hmm.
to figure out how to do that exactly. So I with the metrics that I mentioned, we haven't implemented these yet, but I really look forward to seeing how that works out, right? And
Yeah.
yep,
Yeah.
it'll be a
I
learning experience for me, Harvey.
Yeah, I really enjoy policy work. It's something that really drives me, but getting into the field and kind of learning about it more now, not from an outsider perspective, but an insider perspective, I now recognize that policy work is a long process
Yeah,
and you can't give up. Like just because you hit a wall once, you will hit multiple walls, but it doesn't mean you give up. And I remember in my classes, one thing that my professor taught me is that policy changes due to the political system. And
yeah,
it's you get policy to move forward it's in the way of how you communicate it. It's kind of like saying a policy in a way is kind of like giving a really compelling, persuasive pitch to
yeah,
funders,
yes,
to politicians, to government agencies. It's like, oh, look at this bright new idea. It can help you today. And so it's just turning like it's like a diff change in perspective. And I love policy still, but it's something that I find is so hard because it can never be tangible unless you want it to be tangible.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think it really I have so much respect for those that have come before to do this advocacy, and my new specific project around policy is getting funding for an Indigenous school of medicine
Mm,
that could even have international aspects, and might have regional representation in the U.S. Um, my particular impetus is around Alaska and developing some of the Alaskan outreach and infrastructure that would be necessary to better serve this the region. And um, so this has different aspects that I think about. There's an arm that's looking at residencies, training in medical residencies. So trying to push that. We have an allegiance and an alliance, the American Indian Medical Education Strategies Alliance, that's hoping to fund residencies in Indian country, because 60% of doctors stay where we train in residency. So how are we ever going to recruit people out to rural areas if we
hmm
don't train there, right? Or especially give us a training option that maybe is at home. So we're looking at how to create that infrastructure, and you kind of have to pick your battles. I hope that will get funded soon. And I'm also hoping this Indigenous School of Medicine will get funded soon. But if I don't get started on the proposals, the thinking, the allegiances, the alliances, then how it might not happen in, the next 5 years. But what about 10 or 15?
hmm
And certainly if we think about 50 years, then the $200 million ticket doesn't sound as
Yeah.
overwhelming. But becoming aware that there is an opportunity for us to create new health systems that better address true health, because the systems that we have aren't necessarily promoting health, in my experience and knowledge. Really, they diagnose illness and apply specific remedies there within rather than focusing on wellness, well-being,
Mm-hmm.
and how to be healthy.
It's interesting that you said the system. I would also say it's the environment.
Right.
Um, I I was doing this at my practicum placement. I was actually looking at social cohesion practices in public health. What does that mean? What does that look like? And to me, initially starting that project, I said, okay, what is social cohesion? How do I define this? It took me a week to try to define it because everyone has such different definitions for it. Once I started conceptualizing social cohesion, I started deep diving into what are some practices. You know, it goes beyond just having green space, but I can have a park. But if I have no benches, if I have no shade covering spaces, who's going to use my park? If I put sidewalks in, okay, awesome, I put sidewalks in. But if they're not accessible for people with wheelchairs and they're not the ones where sidewalks, sometimes if a road is here, they have like a 1 inch, like they raised. Well, someone who has a wheelchair, when they're going down, they're gonna go down. So it's like, how do we make it so the sidewalks are in level with the roads? Very minor changes, but it allows community to actually get out to
Yeah.
walk.
Hmm.
And just learning more about this, I realized that so many of our environments are not built for us to be successful. They're not actually built for us to be healthy. So then we rely on these medical models.
Right.
But again, these medical models are not always built to be the most inclusive. So yeah, it's tough. It's a cycle. I feel like all these systems are connected with one another. How do we
Yes.
break them?
Well, slowly, one at a time, but also through coalitions, right? And certainly staying isolated is no way to form a meaningful coalition. So I just want to encourage us all to do our best to reach out into supportive environments. And you speak to something that resonates as true, and I really want to collaborate on this. So recent studies published by Nicole Redvers, Melanie Nadu, and others in Yellowknife show land-based healing camps to be a wonderful,
Mm,
um, healthful intervention for belonging and rates
mm,
of belonging, especially for folks who experience marginalization, LGBTQ two spirit plus people feel safe and heard and welcome in these environments. Others show, right, a sense of belonging and benefit from them. And what I find is giving policymakers access to concepts such as land based healing. And what that includes is the ability to have open fire or cook outdoors and
mm,
have maybe a wall tent structure that has a wood that can be covered and kept dry, right? So basics such as you've described, spaces for people to sit that are covered. That these might be novel type solutions that Native people have known since time immemorial, that we can
mm.
set up shelter and we can give people shelter and we can feed them, right? If and we know how to do this in our communities, what we need is remembering how to do it with a space and reimagining those spaces perhaps as solutions in our communities to feed and provide space for our relatives and ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
I just want to go back to talk about the land based healing camps. Do you think that some of these programs and incentives could be helpful for medical students or pre medical students or even residents? And do you think those could help them learn about what it is when it means when you talk about holistic and land-based medicine and the importance of all of that and how they could potentially integrate it into their practice? The reason I'm asking this question is we actually are we're part of a research project through the Faculty of Social Work here, and they're actually creating mentorship and training opportunities for students, and we really want for students to have more opportunities to connect with the land and especially learn about Indigenous communities, not just through textbooks or videos or etc., but actually go to the land themselves and learn directly from knowledge keepers and healers and people.
Wonderful. So I love the opportunity for sharing. And what I have to say is that yes, this is a tremendous opportunity, and settings like the land-based healing camp create, whether it's short or a longer term opportunity to experience and immerse yourself in a cultural setting that I would encourage you to reach out to opportunities locally. So the way that I typically do that is I look for an American Indian or Alaska Native center. So we have urban centers in America. We also have the Indian Health Service. And then we have our tribal clinics that have taken over our health system since the 1980s and 90s. So anyways, we have those settings. In Canada, First Nations people may have organizations and health systems and settings that you can reach out to. And that is, I think, a long-term relationship with the organization. Say, for example, if there are specific students in specific departments, I would have those folks, maybe a leader, a faculty, reach out to who's going to be there long-term, ideally, who reaches out and creates that institution to institution relationship. So that you have organizational structure and support. It doesn't necessarily have to be like leader to leader, but that it could be that formal, right? But also it could be researcher to community member or researcher to health board. A lot of time we have health board. That's how we organize in our communities, right? So there's ways, and those folks will know where the students go. So if there's behavioral health clinic, if there's city clinic, if there's rural clinic, and all the kind of stuff, if there's dental clinic, right? And if there's social work capacity, and we'll be able to plug you into those specific asks. I hope that is helpful. And I would also say that you might want to be aware that there may already be some kind of specific outreach or research opportunities. So check out their online presence. And what I find is I get out the old-fashioned telephone and call people in American Indian, Alaska Native, and First Nations communities, or I will introduce myself, right, with, hi, this is where I'm from. This is what I'm doing, and this is my ask for you, so that it's a kind of a really introducing yourself so that they know how to plug you into the system, because we have a lot of folks wearing a lot of hats that can direct you if you send an email and say, we want to place 20 students, or we want to place 40 students, so that you're kind of asking up front and they know how to direct your question. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's very great advice. And, a lot of these things, it's really hard to know where to start, who to approach. So having just a basic idea of, okay, maybe start out by looking at what organizations already exist and how can we connect with them and how can we support their initiatives. I think that's wonderful. And thank you so much for that advice. I did want to go back because earlier you were talking about systems and how it would be, there are, I wouldn't necessarily say flaws, but there are certain weaknesses of our systems that can be improved. So, especially medical, if you were to design, I guess, a better system, what would that look like? How would we incorporate Indigenous knowledge and practices and healing? And what would that look like from a patient perspective? If I was, for instance, a patient, I was suffering from an illness and I walk into a clinic, what would that treatment look like for me?
Great. Well, thanks so much for the question. And I think we could be really imaginative here and consider a place where you felt welcomed, where perhaps your family and loved ones felt welcomed, and where you could take the time to have all of your needs met and questions answered from the perspective of receiving health and well-being. That might mean
Mm.
that perhaps you might need to stay over a day or two if you've traveled a long way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that also might mean you have perhaps a dispensary and formulary, perhaps medicines nearby, or the access to medicines, and maybe access to pharmaceuticals and an
Yeah.
inpatient hospital stay, access to these kinds of things. Maybe perhaps meeting, if you're an expecting um, person, that you might uh, have access to a doula, someone who can guide you to help them access the 12 different specialties that you and various other imaging or other kinds of referrals that you need for your physical therapy, etc. So complex medical plans can get complex really quickly, and I think we
Mm-hmm.
need unique provider types maybe in this new health system. So health navigators might be one, doulas might be one, and traditional healers that can help us to understand perhaps our plant medicine, um, or other aspects such as energy medicine, where how your environment feels, and that the energy of your body doesn't just stop at your skin, it's continuous with your environment. And
Mm.
you can get EEGs and EKGs to look at your brain and heart rhythms, but also those rhythms, the the electromagnetic and other energies that interconnect each of us and our environment are things that are real palpable and measurable, and that healers can manipulate and help to actually treat. These are concepts that are practiced in Reiki or healing touch, which is very well researched, especially in hospital settings by nurses. But these are all traditional healing techniques, right?
Mm. And why do you think they kind of have taken, like, how you were saying, like, it is like a natural way, but why do you think they don't categorize it as that?
Well, here's what seems to be happening as far as I understand it,
Hmm.
that oftentimes the 4-year degree is a prerequisite to residency. So, what I mean is that MD and DO is thought as essentially equivalent to become eligible to get a residency, and then after that comes a practice. Now, it's
Hmm.
taken some time, that being decades and decades, for DOs to be essentially equivalent to MDs. Like when I was training back in the day in the 90s, it wasn't yet equivalent.
I
Okay,
don't
there's a
think we
reason I make.
have DOs
We don't have
here.
DOs.
Could you explain to our Canadian audience what a DO is?
Yeah, sure. So doctors of osteopathy practice osteopathic medicine, and this is a concept of medicine and a type of medicine that is practiced in America. So, DOs, or doctors of osteopathy, go to a 4-year medical school that's similar but different and unique from MD schools. And osteopaths learn about things like physical manipulation and laying on hands. And so, I've been trained by osteopaths, and what I've learned is how to therapeutically touch and manipulate the physical body to realign, say, muscles, bones, ligaments, these kinds of things. So it's a physical manipulation, distinct from chiropractics,
Mhm.
but the physical manipulation has been passed on by generations of American Indian and Alaska Native healers. And the type of osteopathy I learned from osteopathic teachers is very, very similar, if dare I say, if not the same, as the techniques I learned from my traditional healing teachers.
Mm.
Same techniques. So
Mm.
I learned they were similar practically, and then listening to people and learning about A.T. Stills, the father of osteopathy, I learned that in fact it is a traditional healing technique, right?
Mm.
Um, so in America we have DOs, and DOs can go to residencies and be in practice, and they have their own unique type of training that's called osteopathic medical school, and they've become doctors of osteopathy.
Interesting. I do know that Canada is actually, this may be false, but this is what I have heard is that Canada is, I think, recognizing DOs as MD. If someone were to go to America right now and train as a DO and come back, they would do their residency as a MD, which I think is a good step forward for Canadians. Because like you were saying, remember when you were saying wherever you train in your residency is usually where people stay. We're having a lot of issues with trying to get physicians to go to rural parts of the country as well. Um, and it's being really tough on our system because our healthcare system is feeling very overwhelmed and overburdened.
Uh,
Yeah, and guess this would be a nice way to kind of go into this new topic is can you let us know what the difference is between a public and a private healthcare system? Are there benefits to either side? And do you think that one is better than the other, or do you think both have their own pros and cons?
yeah, sure. So public versus private, uh,
Yes.
pros and cons. So I just want to explain what I chatted in. So what I found is that I did a quick internet search to look at doctors of osteopathy in the Canadian health system, and it looks like
Yes.
many of your provinces have allowed for DOs to match since 2012. So you might
Mm,
not have seen them in your local clinic because they've only been maybe training there since 2012 in residencies. So what you'll look for after a doctor's name is a DO rather than an MD. And
mm,
the distinction is that the DO has been trained with hands-on healing and ideas about how the skeletal system influences the body's well-being, and that alignment in the skeletal system is important for your function of your body,
mm,
simply put. Okay, now question is public and private health systems. The difference between public and private health systems, I suppose, in my mind, simply put, would be that public systems have funding generated outside of one's locus of control or at a federal level, and private systems tend to be funded by companies who are generally for profit, or um, and further, I would say private health systems have to be accessed by wealth, um, or access to something like a job where you can have health insurance to
mm,
access it. So in the United States, we have a couple of safety nets that help us to give people access to health systems. That's Medicare for the elderly,
mm,
and Medicaid for folks who fall under a certain poverty line, or that can also be for folks who have kidney failure, and moms who are expecting and children can be on
mm,
Medicaid. So that means that there's a separate payer that's determined. Medicaid is determined state by state. And it just means that there's a separate payer so that expecting moms don't have to worry about how to pay for their prenatal visit. Um, so in the US, we have mostly a private payer system outside of those settings that I explained. And hey, I'm going to tell you a story. One of my friends recently had a diagnosis and crowdfunded some money. And in this private payer system we have in the US, because she crowdfunded money to pay for a treatment in Mexico for her breast cancer, her money she crowdfunded was considered income, and now she's not eligible for Medicaid anymore. So this is really happening real time every day. for people who should have access to health care. Okay. Here's another example. If I don't have insurance, I can't afford my $7,000 a month migraine medicine.
I'm speechless. These things are really hard to conceptualize and wrap your head around because the people who do have certain illnesses or require certain medications are the most impacted, and they're the ones that are not receiving the health care that they need.
It just makes me question that if you can't afford it, like what do you do?
Right. Isn't that important? Well, what you do is create an opportunity for people to learn traditional healing so we can get the medicine back into the hands of the people.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm. Yeah.
As best I can, right? As best I can, because getting into a system that limits access by definition, frankly, isn't going well for those
Hmm.
who become increasingly um, more marginalized.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Canada is a public system and it's not the best, but it is pretty, I mean, people are able to access it. It's just we do sometimes have really long wait times.
Years
Yes,
Um,
sometimes.
yeah, and so that's where the private gets better because if you do need immediate care,
yes,
you can get it right away.
yes,
But actually in Canada, they are thinking about privatizing healthcare, not
yes.
fully, but half-half. Do you think like we said, privatizing healthcare, the access to it is for people who do have the ability to access it?
Yeah.
And in your opinion, do you think going from public to private is something that is good or something that may alleviate some of the burden that's put on the healthcare system?
I think that I would trust Canadians to know their health system a heck of a lot better than Dr. Kelliher from Nome,
Yeah.
Alaska. But I do have to say I appreciate the question. And what I would say is that there's so many wonderful things to say about privatizing. There's increased competition that can lead to sometimes decreasing, costs for care overall, but really increasing access, right? And dare I say that you can wait for another provider or get access to someone else for a really important question to get a second opinion. Um,
Hmm.
for example, I think there's lots of benefits to having private systems. I think also, um, I guess what I would say is I guess what I would say is I think it's healthy to have options. Okay.
Yeah.
Really. And what I've worked in both types of systems. I've worked in the Indian Health Service on reservation settings, and what I saw was that the health care that we receive in rural settings where the health care is public is not as high of quality as the health care that I see in private settings
Hmm.
in urban settings. Okay.
Hmm.
As far as outcomes and care that's delivered, even if you look at those two populations and compare them, right? And there's a lot of different variables there. So I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but I could say that generally having options is good in medicine so that we don't become complacent and so that we're able to access more than just one limited pocket.
That's
Hmm.
a great answer. I think
Yeah.
both systems have their advantages and disadvantages, but I guess we have to figure out what is, I guess, best for each country because then again, there's a lot of differences between um, Canadians and Americans as well. So what might work for us just might not work for the United States and etc. And I guess my follow up question would be does do having these public versus private healthcare systems does that make it more easier or difficult to integrate indigenous practices or traditional healing practices?
Great. Thanks so much for asking. These are such so nuanced. So in the U.S., Native people have tribal sovereignty, and thus we have the ability to practice medicine within this our within our jurisdiction, if you will. So,
Mm.
what I mean is because I'm trained as an acupuncturist or because I'm trained in a certain way, a tribe can hire me to practice acupuncture. And they may choose to not necessarily require a full licensure, especially because I'm an MD. Okay, so
Interesting.
the tribes have the ability to self determine with sovereignty my ability to practice as a traditional healer, for example.
Mm.
Mm.
And so I think there's a lot to be said for now. Which what does that fall under? Is that's a little bit of the private government world giving us that status, right? But then also it's tribes taking that sovereignty into our own private control, if you will. And then we can, in the US, if we have a private office, I can still bill Medicare or Medicaid. It takes a lot of paperwork and it's very, very hard to do billing wise because it's not as easy as working with the private insurance companies, right? But we can pay out we can bill out federal payers in the private world. So for us in the US, some of us can see a mixture of private and public payers. What I've seen is that tribes can take public funding and private funding and combine them into a very flexible system where they can provide healthcare by traditional healers. They can fund their traditional healing department directly.
Mm-hmm.
So their traditional healing department doesn't have to necessarily generate revenue. Sometimes their existence is a gift from the overall systems. We could show that establishing care with a traditional healer decreased overall visits and decreased overall costs of care. Some of our patients were seeing 12 specialty visits a year, and we could decrease them to one specialty visit a year. We could decrease demands on mental health and behavioral health. We could. So there's a conversation I think that can be had promoting awareness of traditional healing, and then really looking at what assets are and how it could be incorporated, say, for example, into learning settings. So, at the very least, in things like medicine, nursing, behavioral health practices, social work, all of the helping and healing realms for curriculum could be incorporating this knowledge. But it's not even unique to First Nations people, but it's actually global systems of health and well-being exist and at the very least should be acknowledged in your medical education, for goodness sakes. Is it not a comprehensive medical education? Or are we just going to leave out huge swaths of human existence and knowledges because why? Because we're refusing to acknowledge them as valuable? Well, they are valuable, right? So
Yeah.
I think it's an opportunity for us to kind of evolve. That's the opportunity I see, even though creating opportunities as they exist in the private and public realm sometimes remain to be determined. What we did is got support from the American Medical Association to say that they support the practice of traditional healing. And even we obtained 1115 waivers at the federal level for 4 states allowing for traditional healing to be reimbursed by Medicaid.
Yeah. And I agree with you completely that we should be incorporating this knowledge in any fields that are about helping people when it comes to their mental, physical, spiritual, and like I did in my undergrad, I did kinesiology, and it was after I graduated where I talked to one of the professors and I said, "Hey, like when I was in class, I felt like an outsider. I was learning all the Western way of being healthy, but the Western way of being healthy is not my way of being healthy. It's not my community's way of being healthy."
Yeah.
And so we started doing a paper. We're working on this paper where we're looking at, how can we decolonize
Yes.
kinesiology curriculum?
Yes. I love
And it
it.
should, yeah, and it should not just be kinesiology. Let's talk about social work. Let's
Yes.
talk about psychology. Let's talk
Yes.
about beyond just, like why are we not incorporating different perspectives in our education? Education should be well-rounded. And
Yes.
if you don't incorporate these unique perspectives, it's not well-rounded. You're just telling me what you want me to know, and that is from a colonial perspective. But your universities have these missions and values to be decolonize. So it's just two plus two is not equaling four.
Yes, yes, two plus two is orange. So
Yeah.
yes, I know it's the work, and I can't wait for us to continue to do this work. So right now, I'm working on a scoping review about medical school curriculum. I
Yeah.
can say that specifically, there's a University of New Mexico publication that looks at we call it preventative medicine specialty. And what
Mm,
they did is they created an opportunity for learners to go on to pueblos, traditional spaces that where Native people live,
mm,
where American Indian people are, and that their learners would go and have a real live experience in person in an immersive environment with healers. And that by far increased their willingness to feel proficient and capable and safe in environment caring for Native peoples, but also increased their appreciation overall for
mm.
their medical education and kept their interest. So there's a lot of untangible benefits to helping to give exposure to Native and non-Native learners environments where Native teachers are.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It is
I like
super
that.
interesting, right?
That's
So
interesting.
it's not just important for Native people, it's important for all people, right?
Everyone.
This is the thing about when we have literally segregated our minds based on this weird color construct and social constructs such as race that really have, I think, um, impeded our ability to reach out and
Hmm.
truly be more human to each other around this business. We can create systems that share indigenous knowledges with permission and respect to benefit all learners.
Mm.
100% agree. Yeah, I think the overall goal, whether that's Western medicine, whether that's Indigenous medicine, Chinese traditional medicine, or anything else, is to promote the health and well being of everyone. So, why can't we just all work together and, improve the well being of the entire community? I think that should be the ultimate goal, like Harveen said.
How do you envision the next generation of traditional healers and Indigenous healthcare practitioners?
What I envision is that each family, especially each community, has someone that they know is a traditional healer and knowledge bearer who can help they or their loved ones to navigate through life and
Hmm.
especially to navigate through our complex health system. So I see us as traditional healers playing an essential role to gain access to um, health systems and health services that we might not otherwise gain access to. Our
Hmm.
real life story from just today, right? Trying to coach expand our access because we don't always have access to providers, and so what I think of is kind of like community health workers and community health aides in Alaska, where we have these folks that help us extend our antennas and our feelers as providers so that we
Hmm.
have real relationships with these folks in our community and their assets to the health system.
And I do have to say that, you know, everything begins with human connection and it goes beyond talking to a traditional healer, them helping you in your physical realm, but it actually helps you in your spiritual realm. It helps you in your mental realm. It helps you in that social cohesion practices I was talking about. It
Yes,
helps build trust with the community. And I
yes,
think we need to recognize that human connection and doing that really feeds on all those wellness models, and it's just really helpful that it ties everything together. And so I sometimes don't always love just focusing on the health because I
yes.
think we need to focus on the complete picture.
Yes, so that there's a new concept of thrivance that may be
Hmm.
of great interest to you. I've just been, I mean, it's a new ancient concept. You know how every like
Yeah.
all indigenous concepts are suddenly, if you name them, we get a new word. Ooh, knowledges. It's just plural, but it's knowledges, right?
Yeah.
But Thrivance is pretty cool, and I think it might be up your alley. And I'm sure it's an area that you might find rich to be publishing in.
Hmm.
So check it out. yeah, check it out. I think
Thrivens.
there's a couple articles that I found about it that I've been sprinkling into my recent talks. And
Mm,
we even named, so we got this cross-cultural medicine conference coming up in Albuquerque, concurrent with the largest powwow in the world, the Gathering of Nations. And the Association for American Indian Physicians is going to have this conference, and we called it Thrivence for future well-being. And
mm,
so it's a great new buzzword, but I think it also describes kind of what you're saying. I hope I'm not wrong in that regard, but it might be fun
mhm.
for you to dive into.
I think we'll need to do a second episode with you, Dr. Kelleher, to talk more about Thrivence and talk about your work because, to be very honest, I think we've only touched a very, very small portion of your work and a very small portion of all the knowledge that you have to offer. So before we wrap up officially, we have one more question for you. And since our name is Many Different Birds, if you were a bird, what bird would you be and why?
You know, I believe I would become the Arctic tern. The reason is they voraciously protect their nest,
Mm,
and they are great travelers.
mm,
And I'm 4,000 miles. I'm so many kilometers from home, right, for me. But I still feel home doing the advocacy here in Washington, D.C., or trying to influence the through the platforms at the United Nations. I feel like the Arctic tern migrates longer and further than any other bird, but can find its way home and remember who she is. So
mm.
I really appreciate the question, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
You as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Allison Kelliher, for coming, being our first international guest. I learned a lot from you, and it was just a really good conversation. And like Nidhi said, we barely scratched the surface. So we would love to have you on again so we can talk more about your work, more about your practice. But thank you so much for coming. And last but not least, we want to thank CJSW, the Indigenous Global and Local Health Office, Grandmother's Lounge, and the You Create team for setting up this podcast, and we're getting it started and running again. We couldn't have done this without your support and your knowledge. So thank you again.
Lastly, thank you to everyone who tuned in. Remember to join us on CJSW, Spotify, and Apple Music for bi-weekly episodes on all topics of healthcare with special guests and your two favorite hosts, Nidhi and Harveen. Keep a lookout for the next episode, and until then, stay warm.